Sarah Washington had been awake for 23 hours straight when her daughter's fever spiked to 103.8 degrees. The red numbers on the digital thermometer blurred as exhaustion fought with rising panic in her chest. Emma's usually bright eyes were glassy, her dark curls matted with sweat against her small face. This wasn't like her previous fevers. Something was different, worse. "Mommy, it hurts," Emma whimpered, curling into herself on her unicorn-covered bedsheets. The word sent Sarah into action. Within minutes, she had bundled Emma in her favorite purple blanket, grabbed her insurance card, and strapped her 6-year-old into the back seat of their aging Honda Civic. The car's engine protested briefly before rumbling to life in the pre-dawn darkness. The streets of Pine Grove were eerily empty at 4:30 a.m., streetlights casting long shadows across the damp asphalt. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Emma drift in and out of consciousness. Each time her daughter's eyes closed, Sarah's foot pressed a little harder on the accelerator. Memorial Hospital was just 10 minutes away. She knew the route by heart after 3 years working there as a pediatric nurse. "Stay with me, baby," Sarah called softly, taking the corner onto Maple Drive a touch faster than usual. "Tell Mommy about what you want to do for your birthday next month." She needed to keep Emma talking, keep her engaged. The silence from the backseat was deafening. The speedometer crept upward as they passed the darkened windows of familiar landmarks. Mrs. Chen's flower shop, the library where they spent Saturday mornings, the park where Emma had learned to ride her bike. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she mentally calculated the quickest route to the emergency room entrance. That's when she saw the flash of red and blue lights in her mirror. Sarah's heart plummeted. She checked her speed, 47 in a 30 zone. Her first instinct was to keep driving. The hospital was only 3 miles away. But years of living in Pine Grove had taught her the consequences of that choice. With trembling hands, she guided the car to the curb, hazard lights blinking in the darkness. The beam of a flashlight swept through her car windows as heavy footsteps approached. Sarah reached for her purse, retrieving her license and registration with practiced movements. The tap on her window made her jump despite expecting it. License and registration. Officer Miller's voice was clipped, professional. Sarah recognized him from his visits to the hospital's coffee shop, though his face showed no sign of recognition now. His flashlight beam lingered on Emma in the backseat. "Officer, my daughter's running a high fever. I'm a nurse at Memorial, and I need to get her to the emergency room." Sarah's voice remained steady, even as her heart raced. "Please, she needs medical attention." Officer Miller's expression didn't change as he examined her documents. "Ma'am, you were doing 17 over in a residential zone. Do you know how many accidents we've had on this street?" Sarah glanced back at Emma, who had started shivering despite the warm night. "I understand, sir, but this is an emergency. I can show you her temperature reading. Call her pediatrician. Please stay in your vehicle while I run your information." Officer Miller cut her off, stepping back from the car. Sarah watched in her side mirror as he walked to his patrol car, her daughter's quiet whimpers filling the silence. The next 7 minutes felt like an eternity, measured only by Emma's labored breathing and the rhythmic flash of police lights against nearby houses. Sarah's phone showed 4:42 a.m. when Officer Miller returned with a citation pad in hand. 2 weeks later, Sarah smoothed her nurse's uniform for the 3rd time as she sat on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom B. The early morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Her mother, Eleanor, sat beside her, already in her Sunday best, despite it being Tuesday. "Baby, you should have let me help with the fine," Eleanor whispered, patting Sarah's hand. But Sarah shook her head, pride straightening her spine. After 15 years of independence, of proving everyone wrong about single mothers, she wouldn't break now. "Emma's medical bills wiped out my savings, Mama. But I'll handle this myself." Sarah watched as other people filed into the courtroom, some in suits, others in work clothes like herself. She'd taken a precious vacation day for this appearance, arranging her shift coverage weeks in advance. The massive oak doors creaked open at exactly 9:00 a.m. A court officer emerged, his voice carrying down the hallway. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Whitman." Sarah entered the courtroom, her sensible shoes silent on the thick carpet. The room smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. Ahead, Judge Whitman settled into his high-backed leather chair, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers above. His reputation preceded him, 25 years on the bench, known for running his courtroom with military precision. "First case," the clerk announced, shuffling papers. "Traffic citation number 2024 TR 789. State versus Washington. Sarah L." Sarah's legs felt wooden as she approached the podium. The court-appointed attorney she met briefly that morning, Mr. Peters, stood beside her, his cheap cologne making her nose itch. She noticed Judge Whitman studying her paperwork, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. "Ms. Washington," Judge Whitman's voice filled the room, "you're charged with exceeding the posted speed limit by 17 miles per hour in a residential zone. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Mr. Peters started, but Judge Whitman raised his hand. "I'd like to hear from Ms. Washington directly." The judge's pale blue eyes fixed on Sarah, his expression unreadable. Sarah swallowed hard, her nurse's training kicking in. Clear voice, professional demeanor. "Your Honor, I acknowledge I was speeding, but my daughter was running a dangerous fever. As a pediatric nurse, I recognize the symptoms off." "Ms. Washington," Judge Whitman interrupted, "I see you've submitted medical records from that night. However, this court has heard many creative explanations for excessive speed. What makes your emergency more valid than anyone else's?" The question hung in the air. Sarah felt her mother shift behind her in the gallery. Through the tall courthouse windows, she could see the hospital where she'd spent countless nights caring for other people's children, where Emma had spent 3 days recovering from what turned out to be a severe case of strep throat. "Your Honor," Sarah's voice remained steady, "I make no excuses for breaking the law. But as a healthcare professional and a mother, I made a calculated decision. Every minute with a high fever risks complications. I chose my daughter's safety over strict adherence to the speed limit. I accept the consequences of that choice." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitman's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, perhaps, at her candor. He studied her work ID, still clipped to her uniform from her early morning rounds. "Memorial Hospital," he noted, tapping his pen against the bench. "Night shift." "Yes, Your Honor. I came directly from my shift to be here." The judge leaned back, his chair creaking softly. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle whir of the courtroom's air conditioning and the distant click of the clerk's keyboard. Judge Whitman's voice cut through the hushed courtroom like a blade. $2,500 fine, payable within 90 days. He delivered the number without emotion, already reaching for the next case file. Sarah stood frozen at the podium, her fingers gripping the wooden edge as the amount echoed in her mind. Mr. Peters, her court-appointed attorney, shuffled uncomfortably beside her. "Your Honor, given Ms. Washington's circumstances and clean driving record, perhaps we could discuss a reduction. The fine stands, counsel." Judge Whitman's gavel fell with a sharp crack. Next case. Sarah walked out of the courtroom on legs that felt like water. The marble hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly before her. Her mother waited by the water fountain, face creased with concern. Before Eleanor could speak, Sarah held up her hand, needing a moment to breathe. She found herself on a wooden bench near the courthouse steps, autumn leaves dancing around her feet. The morning sun had grown stronger, warming the stone beneath her. Sarah pulled out her phone, opening her banking app with trembling fingers. Her account balance stared back, $1,847.32. "Let me help," Eleanor said softly, settling beside her daughter. "I got some savings." "No, Mama." Sarah straightened her shoulders, nurse's training kicking in again. "Assess the situation. Make a plan. Take action. You need that money for your medicine. She pulled up her calculator app, fingers flying over the numbers. Rent, $1,200. Utilities, $180. Car payment, $265. Insurance, $140. Groceries, $400. Emma's dance lessons, $75. The numbers blurred together as she added the new $2,500 obligation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma's dance instructor. Costume payment for recital due next week, $120. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Emma twirling in her living room, dreaming of being on stage. I can pick up extra shifts, Sarah murmured, more to herself than her mother. The hospital always needs coverage, and that new convenience store on Oak Street is hiring. You're already working 50 hours a week, Eleanor protested. When will you see Emma? The question hit hard. Sarah watched a young mother pass by, holding her daughter's hand as they climbed the courthouse steps. The little girl wore light-up sneakers, each step creating tiny bursts of color against the gray stone. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Her supervisor at the hospital. Can you cover this Saturday? Night shift short-staffed. Her finger hovered over the reply button. Each extra shift meant $280 before taxes. She'd need 9 of them just to cover the fine. Ms. Washington. A quiet voice interrupted her calculations. She looked up to see the court clerk, holding out a packet of papers. These are your payment arrangement forms. You'll need to set up a payment plan at the clerk's office before you leave today. Sarah nodded, accepting the papers. The courthouse clock chimed 10 times, reminding her that Emma would be waiting at school in 6 hours. She hadn't slept since yesterday's night shift. Her uniform felt suddenly heavy on her shoulders, the crisp fabric a reminder of the profession she'd worked so hard to enter. Come on. Eleanor touched her daughter's arm gently. Let's get you some coffee before you handle these forms. Remember what your daddy used to say. Mountains look smaller after a good cup of coffee. Sarah managed a small smile, gathering her papers. The autumn wind picked up, scattering more leaves across the courthouse steps. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell joined the courthouse chimes, their sounds mixing with the steady stream of traffic on Main Street. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's 24-hour store buzzed overhead as Sarah restocked the candy aisle, her nurse's uniform traded for a red polyester vest. 11:47 p.m. glowed from the digital display above the register. Her feet ached from the 16 hours she'd been standing. First at the hospital, now here. Ms. Washington. Tommy, the teenage shift supervisor, approached with a clipboard. Could you stay until 2 a.m.? Jessica called in sick again. Sarah glanced at her phone. No messages from Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watching Emma tonight. Her daughter would be asleep by now, probably curled up with her stuffed giraffe. Homework completed and tucked neatly in her backpack. I can stay, Sarah replied, adjusting her name tag. Each extra hour meant another $12 toward the fine. She'd been at Murphy's for 3 weeks now, working every spare hour between hospital shifts. The store manager had hired her on the spot, impressed by her background in healthcare, perfect for the overnight shift in their sometimes rough neighborhood. The automatic doors chimed as a customer entered, bringing with them a gust of cool night air. Sarah recognized Dr. Chen from the pediatric ward, stopping in for his usual midnight coffee. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, straightening items that didn't need straightening. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Her phone vibrated, a FaceTime request from Emma. Sarah ducked into the break room, its dingy walls covered with employee schedules and safety regulations. Mom. Emma's face filled the screen, sleep-tussled but excited. I got an A on my science project. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me make it perfect before bed. Sarah's exhaustion lifted momentarily. That's wonderful, baby. Tell me all about it. It's about the human heart. Emma beamed. I used your nursing books for research. Everyone loved the part about. The store's intercom crackled. Customer service needed in aisle 3. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I have to go," Sarah interrupted, heart heavy. "But save everything to tell me at breakfast, okay? Don't forget your vitamins before bed." After ending the call, Sarah leaned against the break room wall, allowing herself exactly 30 seconds of weakness. Her eyes burned from fatigue, and her double shifts were starting to show. New lines around her eyes, her scrubs hanging looser on her frame. The break room table held evidence of her new reality: hospital schedule, Murphy's schedule, and a notebook filled with calculations. She'd paid $847 of the fine so far, each dollar earned in these fluorescent-lit hours away from her daughter. "Customer service needed in aisle 3. The intercom repeated impatiently. Sarah straightened her vest and headed out. In aisle 3, she found an elderly man struggling to reach the top shelf. As she helped him select his items, she noticed his medical alert bracelet, similar to one she handled daily at Memorial. "You're that nurse," he said suddenly, squinting at her, "the one who helped my grandson last month. Tommy with the broken arm." Sarah remembered. A busy night shift, a tearful 10-year-old, and dinosaur stickers she'd kept in her pocket to make him smile. The old man's eyes crinkled with kindness. "Life's strange, isn't it?" he mused, patting her hand. "Angels in nurses' uniforms working at convenience stores." After he left, Sarah found a sticky note in her vest pocket while restocking shelves. Emma's careful handwriting declared, "Miss you, Mom. You're my hero." Below it, a drawing of 2 stick figures, one in nurse's scrubs, one in a superhero cape. The store clock read 12:23 a.m. Sarah tucked the note carefully into her pocket, next to her hospital ID and the payment receipt for $847. Outside, the city slept, while inside Murphy's 24-hour store, a mother worked toward dawn, counting down minutes until breakfast with her daughter. Jennifer Chen hadn't planned on stopping at Murphy's that night, but her office coffee maker had surrendered during another late review of court records. The familiar glow of the 24-hour store beckoned like a lighthouse in the sea of darkness. As she pushed through the door, the young lawyer barely noticed her reflection. Dark circles under her eyes, suit wrinkled from 14 hours at her desk. The store was empty except for a woman in a red vest, methodically restocking shelves. Something about her movements caught Jennifer's attention, the precise way she arranged items, like someone used to organizing medical supplies. Their eyes met in the security mirror. "Sarah." Jennifer stepped closer, recognition dawning. "Sarah Washington." Sarah straightened, adjusting her vest self-consciously. "Yes. I'm sorry, have we? I'm Jennifer Chen from Marshall and Associates. I've been reviewing court records from Judge Whitman's traffic court." Jennifer watched understanding flash across Sarah's face. Would you have time for coffee? My treat." 20 minutes later, they sat in the store's small break room, steam rising from paper cups. Sarah's manager had agreed to her break when Jennifer mentioned she was a lawyer. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, but something about the late hour made honesty easier. "I remember your case," Jennifer said, stirring her coffee. "A nurse rushing her daughter to the hospital. The fine seemed." She paused, choosing her words carefully, disproportionate. Sarah's hands tightened around her cup. 3 more months of payments to go. Between hospital shifts and here, I'm managing. How's your daughter? A small smile softened Sarah's exhaustion. Emma's amazing. She leaves me notes everywhere. In my scrubs pockets, my lunch bag. Yesterday said, "Mom, you're like a superhero, but better because you're real." Jennifer pulled out her laptop, its glow joining the fluorescent lights. "I've been tracking patterns in Judge Whitman's sentencing. Similar violations, different demographics." She turned the screen toward Sarah, showing spreadsheets and graphs. "Your fine was 40% higher than average for first-time offenders in similar situations." Sarah stared at the numbers, her nurse's training kicking in, analyzing data, finding patterns. "What does this mean?" "It means you're not alone." Jennifer leaned forward. "And maybe we can do something about it. Not just for you, but for others facing the same situation. The store's intercom crackled. "Break time's over, Sarah." As Sarah stood to return to work, Jennifer reached into her briefcase. "Here's my card. Think about what I said. This isn't about challenging authority. It's about ensuring justice is truly blind." Sarah studied the card. Embossed letters. Prestigious law firm address. "I can't afford." "Pro bono," Jennifer interrupted. "Sometimes the right case finds the right lawyer at the right time." She gathered her things, then paused. "My grandmother worked 2 jobs to put my mother through school. Every night, she'd say, 'Education is heavy, but ignorance is heavier.' Maybe it's time to lighten someone else's load." As Sarah returned to restocking shelves, she kept touching Jennifer's card in her pocket. It sat next to Emma's latest note and the creased payment receipts, symbols of burden and hope, side by side. Outside, the city's lights twinkled like fallen stars. Inside Murphy's 24-hour store, 2 women from different worlds had connected over coffee and conscience. Sarah straightened her vest, straightened her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, the fluorescent lights didn't seem quite so harsh. The store clock read 2:17 a.m. In a few hours, Sarah would head to her hospital shift, then home to Emma. But now, alongside the weight of her fine, she carried something new. The possibility of change, not just for herself, but for others walking similar paths under the same courthouse roof. Judge Robert Whitman couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten at Joe's Diner. The small establishment sat 3 blocks from the courthouse, its neon sign flickering against the early morning fog. He hadn't planned on stopping, but the aroma of coffee and bacon had drawn him in before his morning docket. The bell chimed softly as he entered, his silver hair still damp from his morning swim. Only 2 other customers occupied the worn leather booths, a truck driver nursing his coffee, and a woman in blue scrubs hunched over paperwork. "Sit anywhere, Judge," called Maria, the owner's daughter. She testified in his courtroom once, years ago, about a fender bender. Strange how faces stuck with you after decades on the bench. He chose a booth by the window, watching the city wake up. The woman in scrubs caught his attention. Something familiar about her profile. She was writing carefully in a notebook, pausing occasionally to check her phone. "Your usual judge." Maria approached with a coffee pot. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. "Please." He watched as she moved to refill the nurse's cup. The woman looked up to thank her, and recognition clicked. Sarah Washington. The speeding case. The emergency room run. He'd seen hundreds of cases since then, but hers had lingered in his memory. Sarah noticed him too. Her spine straightened slightly, but she didn't look away. Something in her steady gaze reminded him of his late wife, Catherine, who'd worked as an ER nurse for 30 years. "Mind if I join you?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Both of them seemed surprised by his question. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. Judge Whitman gathered his coffee and settled across from her. Up close, he could see the fatigue lines around her eyes, the ink stains on her fingers. "Night shift?" he asked, noting her Memorial Hospital ID badge. "Just finished. Heading home soon to get Emma ready for school." She didn't hide her paperwork, bills, schedules, payment receipts. His eyes caught the court's letterhead on one document. "Emma, your daughter. The one from the night of." He left the sentence unfinished. Sarah's expression softened at her daughter's name. "Yes, she's doing much better. Made the honor roll last week." She hesitated, then reached for her phone. "Would you like to see her science project? It's about the human heart." The judge found himself looking at a photo of a bright-eyed girl standing proudly next to a detailed cardboard display. Something about her smile tugged at his memory. Catherine had kept photos of their grandchildren's science fairs on his desk. "She wants to be a doctor," Sarah continued, her voice carrying equal measures of pride and worry. "I'm trying to teach her that every dream has a path, even if it's not a straight line." Maria arrived with his eggs. The simple act of sharing breakfast seemed to dissolve the formal barriers between them. They weren't judge and defendant anymore, just two people watching the sun rise over coffee. "Your wife was in Mirrors, wasn't she?" Sarah asked gently. "I remember seeing her photo in your office during my hearing. 40 years in healthcare. She always said every patient had a story worth hearing." He paused, studying his reflection in the coffee. "Sometimes I wonder if I've forgotten that from the bench." The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered. Outside, the courthouse loomed against the brightening sky. But here, in this moment, justice took a different shape, not blind and cold, but seeing and warm, served with coffee and understanding. The courthouse conference room buzzed with quiet energy as judges, lawyers, and community representatives gathered around the long oak table. Judge Whitman sat at one end, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the proposal before him. Sarah Washington and Jennifer Chen occupied seats halfway down the table, their presence a testament to how far things had come. "The data speaks for itself," Jennifer was saying, her presentation displayed on the wall behind her. "But numbers only tell half the story. The human impact of our current system needs consideration." Sarah watched the faces around the table. Some she recognized from her own court experience, others were new. But all were listening. Really listening, as Jennifer outlined the proposed changes to the traffic court system. "We're not suggesting complete overhaul," Jennifer continued. "Rather, a more nuanced approach, income-based fine scaling, community service options, and most importantly, a standardized review process for emergency situations." Judge Whitman removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Chen, Ms. Washington, you've given us much to consider. The patterns you've identified." He paused, glancing at Sarah. "They're impossible to ignore." The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver in his hair. Sarah remembered their chance meeting at Joe's Diner 2 months ago. Since then, she'd seen subtle changes in his courtroom. More questions asked, more stories heard. "If I may," Sarah spoke up, her voice steady. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about building a system that protects public safety while recognizing human realities." She touched the nurse's badge at her collar. "In healthcare, we constantly review and adjust our procedures to better serve patients. Why should justice be any different?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Judge Martinez, a newly appointed justice, leaned forward. "What about implementation? Training requirements?" "We've developed a comprehensive workshop series," Jennifer replied, changing slides, "starting with implicit bias training, but extending to practical scenarios. Real cases, real people, real consequences." Sarah watched Judge Whitman as he studied the proposal again. She thought of Emma, who'd asked just that morning why her mom seemed happier lately. Because sometimes, Sarah had told her, doing what's right feels like flying. "I propose we establish a pilot program," Judge Whitman announced, his voice cutting through the quiet discussions. 3 months implementing these guidelines in my courtroom. "Ms. Washington, would you be willing to serve on the advisory committee?" Sarah straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yes, Your Honor. I would be honored." As the meeting concluded, people gathered in small groups, discussing implementation details. Sarah found herself beside Judge Whitman at the coffee station. "You know," he said quietly, stirring his coffee, "Catherine, my wife, she used to say that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about seeing the whole person." He looked at Sarah. "I think perhaps justice needs the same approach." Through the conference room windows, Sarah could see the courthouse steps where her story had begun months ago. Now those same steps seemed less daunting, more like a bridge between what was and what could be. The clock on the wall read 10:30 a.m. In a few hours, she would pick up Emma from school. Tonight, for the first time in months, she wouldn't be working at Murphy's. The manager had understood when she'd given notice, had even hugged her goodbye. "Small steps," Jennifer said, joining them. "But in the right direction." Sarah nodded, watching as autumn sunlight painted the conference room golden. Sometimes justice, like healing, began with a simple question. What if we tried a different way? 1 year later, Sarah stood at the podium in Memorial Hospital's conference center, facing a room full of first-year law students. The morning light streamed through tall windows, catching the silver threads in her freshly pressed uniform. She'd just finished the night shift, but adrenaline kept her alert. Speaking about change had that effect. The law isn't just words on paper, she said, her voice carrying to the back row, where Judge Whitman sat, now a regular guest speaker for these sessions. It's alive in every decision we make, every story we choose to hear. Emma, now 12, sat in the front row, tablet in hand, taking notes. Her science fair medal gleamed against her neat school uniform. Sarah caught her daughter's proud smile and felt her heart swell. When I stood in traffic court that morning, Sarah continued, I never imagined it would lead here, to a reform system that's helped over 300 families in our county alone, to mandatory review processes for medical emergencies, to income-based fine scaling that's reduced repeat offenses by 40%. The students leaned forward, pens moving across notebooks. Among them sat Tommy, her former supervisor from Murphy's, now a pre-law student himself. He'd said her story had inspired him to change careers, to be part of the solution. But numbers only tell part of the story. Sarah touched her nurse's badge, still worn with pride. The real change happens in moments. Like when a single mother can keep her child in dance classes because her traffic fine didn't devastate her finances, or when a judge takes time to hear why someone was speeding before making a decision. Judge Whitman nodded slightly, his own journey of transformation visible in the gentle lines of his face. The pilot program in his courtroom had expanded to the entire county, then caught the attention of state officials. Change, like healing, spread when given the chance. Last week, Sarah's voice softened. I treated a little boy in the ER. His mother had run a red light, rushing him in with an asthma attack. Under the old system, she'd have faced a fine she couldn't pay. Instead, she met with a review board the next day. They considered her circumstances, her clean record. She left with a reduced fine and information about asthma management programs. Emma raised her hand, though she knew the story. Did the little boy get better, Mom? Sarah smiled at her daughter's question. He did, and his mother didn't have to choose between his medicine and paying a fine. That's what justice looks like when we remember the humanity behind each case. After the presentation, students gathered around Sarah and Judge Whitman, asking questions, sharing stories. Jennifer Chen, now a partner at her firm, watched from the doorway, their successful collaboration having sparked similar initiatives across the state. Later, as Sarah gathered her things, she found a note tucked into her bag. Emma's handwriting had matured, but her heart remained the same. Mom, today you helped future lawyers understand what you taught me long ago, that doing the right thing matters more than being right. Outside, the hospital grounds bloomed with spring flowers. Sarah's next shift started in 12 hours, but first, she and Emma had plans. Homework, dinner, and preparation for Emma's upcoming speech at the Youth Leadership Conference. No more missing moments, no more double shifts at convenience stores. The morning sun painted the hospital walls golden, much like it had in that courthouse conference room a year ago. Sarah touched her badge, then her daughter's shoulder. Sometimes justice, like love, grew stronger when tested. And sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments. A fever, a traffic stop, a chance meeting in a diner. Life had come full circle, but the circle had widened, making room for more stories, more understanding, more hope.